The Harris house had always looked its best at Christmas. Warm light spilled from every window, wrapping the quiet suburban street in something that felt generous and forgiving. Inside, the scent of roasted turkey and cloves hung in the air, layered with pine from the tree in the corner of the living room. Claire had spent all afternoon arranging and rearranging, smoothing tablecloth edges, adjusting place settings, chasing a version of harmony she wanted to believe was still possible. Tom stood in the doorway to the dining room for a moment before anyone noticed him. At 58, his shoulders were still broad, his posture straight from decades of habit rather than pride. He wore a pressed button-down, sleeves rolled once, as if ready to help carve or clear. He took in the scene like a man surveying something he'd built himself. This house, this family, this tradition. It had cost him years of long hours and missed moments, but nights like this were supposed to make it worth it. Ryan was already seated, scrolling his phone, laughing softly at something on the screen. His wife sat beside him, chatting with Claire's brother Michael, while plates clinked and chairs scraped gently across the floor. It looked normal, almost peaceful. That illusion carried Tom the final few steps to the table. As always, he pulled out the chair at the head. It wasn't something he'd ever demanded. It had simply become the place everyone expected him to sit. Tom rested his hands on the back of the chair, feeling the familiar groove worn smooth by years of dinners just like this. For a brief second, he allowed himself to feel content. Then Ryan looked up. "That seat's for my father-in-law," Ryan said casually, as if pointing out an error on a restaurant bill. The words landed heavier than they should have. Conversation died mid-sentence. Silverware paused in mid-air. Someone cleared their throat too loudly. Tom didn't move at first, not because he hadn't heard, but because his mind refused to accept that this moment was real. Ryan finally met his eyes. There was no apology there, no awkward smile, just expectation. Claire stepped in quickly, her voice light but strained. "Ryan, honey, let's not start. There are plenty of seats." "Tom, why don't you—" "It's fine," Tom said before she could finish. His voice surprised even him. Calm. Flat. He released the chair slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter whatever dignity he had left. No one laughed. No one argued. The silence stretched, thick and humiliating. Tom felt heat crawl up his neck, but he kept his face composed, offering a small nod as though this had been a reasonable request. He chose a seat farther down the table, one that faced the wall instead of the family. When he sat, the chair felt unfamiliar, lower somehow. Dinner resumed in fragments. Laughter returned in pieces, forced at first, then more natural as people clung to safer topics. Tom pushed food around his plate, nodding when spoken to, smiling when expected. Inside, something old and solid was cracking. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of damage that couldn't be undone. He excused himself after a few minutes, blaming a headache. No one stopped him. The study was cool and dim, the fire already lit from earlier. Tom closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, breathing slowly. From here, the sounds of the dinner were distant, muffled laughter, the clink of glasses like a life happening somewhere else. His gaze drifted to the desk. The folder sat exactly where it always did, thick and plain, labeled in his own handwriting. Deed, trust, documents he rarely touched, because they represented stability, something fixed and unquestioned. He crossed the room and sat heavily in the chair, resting his hands on the folder without opening it yet. He thought of Ryan as a boy, trailing behind him through this same house, asking questions. Tom was always too busy to answer fully. He thought of the seat at the table and how easily it had been taken from him. Tom opened the folder. The papers inside caught the firelight, edges glowing faintly. Outside the study door, laughter rose again. Louder now, unburdened. Tom didn't join it. He stared at the documents, at the quiet power they represented, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider what it would mean to stop protecting what no longer protected him. The fire cracked softly beside him as his resolve began to settle into place. Sleep never really came that night. It only hovered, close enough to taunt him. Tom lay on his back, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house settling around him. Every time his eyes closed, Ryan's voice cut through the darkness with surgical precision. "That seat's for my father-in-law." Not shouted, not angry. Worse, casual, dismissive, as if Tom's place in his own home was negotiable now. Tom shifted, jaw tightening, the memory replaying with cruel consistency. The way no one had spoken up. The way the laughter eventually returned without him. He felt it again, that controlled humiliation. The kind that didn't explode but seeped inward, corroding something fundamental. Beside him, Claire slept lightly, turning now and then. Near dawn, she stirred and whispered his name. "You're still awake," she murmured. Tom didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. "I keep thinking about it." Claire sighed, propping herself up on one elbow. "Tom, it was awkward, yes, but you're taking it too hard. Ryan's under a lot of pressure right now. Work, money. He didn't mean it the way you're taking it." Tom turned to face her. In the faint light from the window, he saw exhaustion in her eyes, but also something else, avoidance. "He meant exactly what he said," Tom replied. "And everyone heard it." Claire reached for his arm. "He's stressed. You know how he gets. He's trying to prove himself." Tom gently moved his arm away. He didn't raise his voice. That restraint made the words heavier. "Prove himself to who?" Claire didn't answer. By morning, Tom had made his decision not in anger, but in clarity. He showered, dressed, and drank his coffee standing at the counter, untouched toast growing cold beside him. He felt hollowed out, but focused, like a man bracing before impact. For years, support had been automatic. Help, bailouts, quiet transfers, labeled temporary. He told himself it was what fathers did. That ended now. The phone rang mid-morning. Ryan's name lit the screen. Tom watched it buzz for a moment before answering. "Yes, Dad." "Perfect timing," Ryan said, upbeat, almost cheerful. "I wanted to run something by you. I've got this new opportunity really solid this time. Short-term capital, but the returns—" "No," Tom said. There was a pause. "No. What?" "No money," Tom replied evenly. "Not for this. Not for anything." Ryan laughed once, uncertain. "Dad, come on. Don't do this today. I just need a bridge." I said no. Tom's voice was calm, stripped of warmth. "You're 34. Figure it out." The silence on the other end sharpened. "Is this about last night?" Ryan asked. "Because if you're holding a grudge—" "This isn't a discussion," Tom interrupted. "I'm done funding your life." Ryan's tone shifted, irritation creeping in. "You're overreacting. You always do this, make things about respect when—" The call ended. Tom didn't hang up in anger. He simply pressed the button and set the phone down. Hands steady, heart pounding. An hour later, his phone rang again. This time, it was Jessica. "Dad," she said gently, the distance in her voice softened by concern. "I had a feeling something was off. Mom sounded careful." Tom sat at the kitchen table, staring at the grain of the wood. "Your brother crossed a line," he said, "and I let him cross too many before that." Jessica was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I already did it," Tom replied. "I stopped." She exhaled slowly. "Just don't let this turn you into someone you don't recognize." After the call ended, Tom remained seated, phone dark in his hand. Outside, the neighborhood moved on. Cars passing, children laughing somewhere down the street. Inside, something had shifted permanently. The fury was still there, but it was no longer loud. It had settled, dense and deliberate, forming into something far more dangerous than anger. Resolve. The fallout didn't stay private for long. By the second day after Christmas, the news had threaded its way through the family like an exposed wire. Ryan hadn't bothered to keep it quiet. Phone calls were made, messages sent, carefully edited versions of the truth, circulated versions where Tom wasn't a measured father drawing a boundary, but a cold man abandoning his own son out of spite. Tom felt it in the shift of tone when relatives called, polite concern layered over judgment. A cousin asked, gently, if everything was all right financially. An old friend joked about tightening the purse strings. Tom answered calmly, saying little, letting the rumors burn themselves out. Inside, though, he felt the weight of it. Not regret, but the understanding that once money entered the story, love was always the first casualty. Ryan didn't hide his anger. He showed up unannounced 2 nights later, storming into the living room like a man looking for a fight. "You think this makes you strong?" he snapped. "Cutting me off? Right after Christmas? What kind of father does that?" Tom didn't rise from his chair. He looked at his son the way one looks at a stranger who happens to know your name. "A father who's done being used," he replied. "You're abandoning your responsibility," Ryan shot back. "Family takes care of family. That's what you taught me." Claire stood between them before Tom could answer, her hands trembling as she pressed them together. "Please," she said, voice breaking. "Enough. We are not doing this again. Ryan, sit down. Tom, say something that doesn't sound like a verdict." But the fracture was already there. Words bounced off it instead of crossing. Ryan glared at Tom, waiting for something softer, an apology, a compromise. None came. With a bitter laugh, he turned and left, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the frame. That night, Claire cried quietly in their bedroom. "I don't recognize either of you anymore," she whispered. Tom lay beside her, staring at the dark, knowing that this was the cost of choosing a line and holding it. Peace, he realized, was sometimes just another word for avoidance. The next afternoon, Michael came by. He didn't knock, just walked in like he always had. He set 2 coffees on the table and sat across from Tom, studying him with a look that mixed loyalty and concern. "You need to be careful," Michael said after a long pause. "Ryan's not just angry. He's humiliated." Tom met his gaze. "That wasn't my goal." "I know," Michael replied. "But humiliation makes people reckless, especially when entitlement's been part of the equation." Tom frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying he feels cornered, and cornered people look for leverage." The words lingered after Michael left. Leverage. That night, Tom found himself replaying conversations from the past requests for co-signatures, vague explanations about investments, the way Ryan had always brushed off details with an easy confidence. At the time, Tom had trusted him, or maybe he'd just assumed his own name carried weight enough to protect him. 2 days later, the phone rang with a number Tom didn't recognize. "Thomas Harris?" the woman asked. "Yes. This is Detective Erica Wells. I'm calling regarding a financial inquiry connected to your name." Tom's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of inquiry?" There was a pause on the line, professional, measured. "We've identified several transactions linked to a series of loans under investigation. Your name appears on the documentation." The room felt suddenly smaller. "I haven't taken out any loans," Tom said slowly. "We're aware," Detective Wells replied. "But someone may have acted on your behalf." After the call ended, Tom sat in silence, the hum of the refrigerator loud in his ears. The thought surfaced uninvited, heavy and unwelcome. Has Ryan been using my name? By that evening, Ryan's anger had spilled onto social media. Posts vague enough to avoid specifics, but sharp enough to sting. Comments rolled in sympathy, outrage, encouragement. Tom didn't read them himself, but Claire did, her face paling with each one. "He says you're controlling," she murmured, "that you're punishing him for wanting independence." Tom closed his eyes. Independence. The irony tasted bitter. Later that night, Ryan sent one final message, short and unmistakable. "If you won't give me what I deserve, I'll take it." Tom read it once, then again. He didn't respond. He only felt the shift the moment where hurt hardened into something colder. Whatever line they'd crossed now, there was no stepping back. The reckoning had begun, and Tom knew, with unsettling clarity, that the next blow wouldn't come quietly. Detective Wells asked to meet in person. That alone told Tom everything he needed to know. They sat across from each other in a small conference room at the precinct, the walls bare, the air faintly smelling of old coffee and disinfectant. Tom kept his hands folded on the table, posture rigid, as if control could still be asserted through discipline. Claire sat beside him, her purse clutched tightly in her lap, eyes darting between Tom and the detective. Detective Wells didn't waste time. She slid a thin folder across the table and opened it with practiced calm. "We've completed a preliminary review of the investment documents tied to the loans," she said. "Several signatures appear to be yours." Tom didn't look down yet. "Appear," he repeated. "Yes," she said evenly. "Because they're not." Claire inhaled sharply. Detective Wells continued, her voice steady but unsoftened. "The signatures were falsified. Handwriting analysis confirms they were signed by your son, Ryan Harris." The room seemed to tilt. Tom finally looked at the papers, his name, written with confidence, repeated across multiple pages. He felt something hollow open in his chest. Not explosive, not loud, but devastating in its quiet certainty. Claire's voice trembled. That's not possible," she said. "Ryan wouldn't, he couldn't." Detective Wells met her gaze with sympathy that didn't cross into reassurance. "The accounts those investments funded are registered under a series of shell companies. All of them lead back to your son." Tom's lawyer, seated at the far end of the table, cleared his throat. "We've traced the asset movement," he said. "Funds were redirected systematically, not impulsively. This was planned." Tom nodded once, slowly. Planning meant intention. Intention meant betrayal. Claire pressed her hand to her mouth, tears welling. Shame flickered across her face, not just for what Ryan had done, but for how blind she'd been. "I raised him better than this," she whispered, though she didn't sound convinced. Later that evening, Ryan came to the house. Not angry this time, desperate. He stood in the living room, hands shaking, eyes red-rimmed and frantic. "Dad, please," he said, voice cracking. "I didn't think it would go this far. I was going to fix it. I just needed time." Tom stood across from him, unmoving. "You signed my name," he said quietly. "More than once." Ryan dropped his gaze. "I didn't think you'd notice. I thought if the returns came in, I'd replace everything before I found out," Tom finished. His voice wasn't raised. That was worse. Ryan stepped closer. "They're talking about prison," he whispered. "You can stop this. You have lawyers, influence. Please, Dad. I'll do anything." Tom searched his son's face for something familiar, remorse, fear, the boy he once knew. What he saw instead was calculation layered over panic, need, not accountability. "No," Tom said. Ryan looked up sharply. "No? You made your bed, son," Tom replied. "Now you lie in it." Claire broke then. She sank onto the couch, sobs tearing through her restraint. "How could you say that?" she cried at Tom. "He's your son. He did this because he was desperate, because he was never good enough for you. You were always cold, always distant. This is what that does to a child." The words struck deep, because part of Tom knew they weren't entirely untrue. He had provided structure, security, opportunity, but affection had always felt optional, something assumed rather than expressed. He looked at Ryan, at Claire, at the wreckage between them, and felt grief settle in alongside anger. Still, he didn't move. When Ryan finally left, the house felt emptier than ever. Tom went to his study alone. The fire was low, embers glowing faintly. He opened the safe and stared at the deed folder one last time. The same documents that had once symbolized legacy and trust. He placed the folder inside and locked it away. The click of the safe echoed louder than it should have. Tom stood there in the dim light, jaw set, heart heavy, knowing this was no longer about family arguments or wounded pride. It was about survival. And whatever came next would not be gentle. The house felt heavier in the days that followed, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Tom moved through his routines with mechanical precision: coffee at dawn, paperwork in the study, lights off at night, but his mind kept circling the same place. Not the betrayal alone, the origin of it. He thought about Ryan's childhood in fragments: private schools, tutors, new cars that arrived with a nod instead of a conversation. He had believed provision was love that stability could substitute for presence. Wisdom, he realized now, couldn't be wired into a bank transfer. He had taught Ryan how to live comfortably, but not how to live honestly. That failure sat with him, uncomfortable and undeniable. Claire noticed the shift. One evening, as they stood in the kitchen eating quietly, she finally spoke. "We can't survive another Cold War," she said, not accusing, just exhausted. "Not like this. It will destroy what's left of us." Tom didn't argue. He didn't agree either. He stared at the sink, watching water swirl down the drain, thinking how easy it was for things to disappear without a sound. Jessica called the next day from overseas. Her voice was steady, thoughtful, the way it always was when she saw things others didn't. "Dad," she said, "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But if this turns into revenge, it'll consume you long before it fixes anything." "I'm not looking for revenge," Tom replied. "Then be careful," she said gently, "because that's what anger turns into when it doesn't know where to go. Forgiveness doesn't mean erasing consequences. It means choosing not to poison yourself." Her words lingered after the call ended. Forgiveness. It sounded like surrender, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was control of a different kind. 2 days later, Tom agreed to meet Ryan. The cafe was small and neutral, tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner. Public enough to keep tempers in check, quiet enough to talk. Tom arrived early, choosing a table near the window. When Ryan walked in, Tom barely recognized him. His shoulders were slumped, his movements cautious, like a man approaching a verdict. Ryan sat down slowly. His hands shook as he wrapped them around his coffee. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I didn't think you would." Tom nodded once. "Say what you came to say." Ryan swallowed. "I'm sorry," he said, the words uneven, fragile. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am. I never meant to hurt you. I panicked. I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed." Tom watched him carefully. There was fear there, real fear, and something else, shame, perhaps. Not enough to erase what had been done, but enough to matter. "I'll fix everything," Ryan continued, voice trembling. "I'll sell what I have. I'll take responsibility. I just need help navigating this. Please." Tom leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "I won't protect you from consequences," he said. "No lies, no shortcuts." Ryan nodded quickly. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes." "I'll help with lawyers," Tom said. "Nothing more. And only if you accept full responsibility. Therapy, transparency, repayment, all of it." Ryan's eyes filled with tears. "I will," he said. "I swear." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the cafe filling the space between them. Tom searched his son's face, looking for certainty, for something solid to hold on to. What he found instead was uncertainty, honest, frightened, unresolved. When they stood to leave, there was no embrace, just a brief nod, restrained and heavy with implication. Ryan walked out first, shoulders still hunched, carrying hope carefully, as if it might shatter. Tom remained by the window, watching him disappear down the street. He knew this wasn't reconciliation. It was a pause, a calculated risk, born not of trust, but of duty. As Tom finally stood to leave, one thought settled in with unsettling clarity. Some doors, once closed, never fully reopen, and he had no way of knowing whether this final chance would lead to repair or ruin. The pressure closed in quickly after that meeting. Court notices arrived with crisp envelopes and colder language. Ryan's voice changed on the phone, less swagger, more strain. The confidence that had once defined him began to erode, replaced by a nervous edge that surfaced in rushed explanations and half-finished sentences. Whatever arrogance had fueled his decisions was giving way to fear. Tom saw it, but he didn't soften. His lawyer called one afternoon, tone clipped and urgent. "You need to move now," he said. "If the investigation widens, assets connected to your name could be frozen. Trusts, properties, everything. We should separate and shield what's legally yours before it's caught in the net." Tom stared at the window as the words sank in. Protect assets. The phrase felt transactional, stripped of morality. Still, he understood the necessity. This wasn't about punishing Ryan anymore. It was about preventing total collapse. Ryan, meanwhile, sensed the shift. He showed up again, this time without warning, pacing the living room like a man trapped in his own thoughts. "They're coming down hard," he said, rubbing his face. "Harder than we expected. I need more help, Dad. Just temporarily. You know I'll pay it back." Tom watched him carefully. The desperation was real, but threaded through it was something familiar. The old habit of reaching first for rescue. "I thought we were clear," Tom said. Ryan's voice sharpened. "I'm asking, not demanding. You're manipulating," Tom replied flatly. Ryan's jaw tightened. "You always think the worst of me." "No," Tom said, standing now. "I finally see you clearly." The words cracked something open. Years of restraint snapped, and Tom felt the anger rise, not hot and reckless, but deep and accumulated. "Do you have any idea how long I've been cleaning up after you?" he demanded. "How many times I told myself you'd grow out of it? That this time would be different?" Ryan tried to interrupt, but Tom pressed on. "You mistook support for entitlement. You took without asking. You used my name like it was yours to spend." Claire entered the room quietly, drawn by the raised voices. She froze when she saw their faces. "Please," she said, tears already forming. Not like this. But Tom couldn't stop now. You were my pride, he said, his voice breaking through the room with brutal clarity. Now you're my regret. The words landed hard. Ryan recoiled as if struck. Claire let out a sob, pressing a hand to her mouth, caught between husband and son. Loyalty tearing her in half. That's not fair, Ryan whispered. You never even tried to understand me. I tried, Tom said. I just stopped lying to myself. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ryan shook his head, disbelief hardening into resentment. You don't get to decide who I am, he snapped. Not anymore. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Claire reached for him, but he pulled away. The door slammed behind him with finality that echoed through the house. Silence followed. Tom sank back into his chair, the adrenaline draining from his body. He felt powerful for having finally spoken the truth, but the victory was thin, brittle. Beneath it was emptiness, the quiet cost of words that couldn't be taken back. Claire stood across the room, crying softly. Tom couldn't bring himself to comfort her. He stared at the closed door, knowing the confrontation had drawn a line neither of them could ignore. Whatever came next would test more than their patience. It would test what was left of their family. Silence became the dominant language of the house. Days passed without confrontation, without raised voices, without resolution. Tom and Ryan moved on separate orbits, careful not to intersect. When Ryan came by to collect mail or documents, Tom stayed in his study. When Tom entered the kitchen, Ryan slipped out. It was a truce built on avoidance, and it hollowed the space between them until the house felt larger and colder than it ever had. Claire carried the weight of it quietly. She woke earlier, slept later, and spoke less. Her smiles became reflexive, brittle things she offered to hold the day together. At night, she lay awake beside Tom, staring at the ceiling, her hand resting inches from his without touching. Pride had split her family in two, and she was trapped in the middle, absorbing the fracture without complaint. Jessica wrote often from abroad. Her messages were long, thoughtful, careful not to accuse. One line stayed with Tom more than the rest. Forgiveness isn't weakness, Dad. It's the courage to stop the cycle. He read it more than once, then closed his phone and set it face down, unwilling to decide whether it felt like wisdom or pressure. To keep himself from thinking, Tom buried himself in work. Property matters that had once felt routine now became refuge. He reviewed leases, moved assets, met with lawyers and accountants. Numbers didn't argue. Document didn't disappoint. In the ordered world of contracts and signatures, he felt competent again, emotionally detached, insulated from the chaos his family had become. Ryan, meanwhile, unraveled in the quiet. Without the familiar safety net, he drifted into bitterness. Friends heard his complaints in fragments, how his father had always controlled him, how nothing he did was ever enough. He replayed old grievances until they felt like proof, convincing himself that Tom's distance had shaped every failure. Accountability stayed just out of reach, replaced by resentment that felt easier to carry. Family dinners shrank. When everyone did sit together, the meals were brief and restrained. Conversation hovered around neutral topics, weather, errands, schedules never touching what mattered. Silverware scraped against plates. Glasses clinked too loudly. Each person watched the clock, waiting for permission to leave. On New Year's Eve, the house was quiet again. No guests, no celebration. Just the muted sound of a televised countdown playing in the background. Tom stood at the dining room doorway, looking at the table as if seeing it for the first time. The chair at the far end was empty. It hadn't always been Ryan's seat, but Tom couldn't remember a time when his son hadn't filled it, leaning back too far, speaking too loudly, reaching across plates without asking. The absence felt heavier than his presence ever had. Tom pulled out his own chair and sat, hands resting on the table, listening to laughter echo faintly from the screen. The final seconds of the year ticked away, unnoticed. As fireworks erupted somewhere beyond the windows, Tom stared at the empty chair, the loneliness settling deep and unmoving. He wondered if this was the price of holding his ground or the cost of holding on too tightly. Either way, the new year arrived without answers, and the silence remained. The call came late in the afternoon, when the light outside had already begun to dull. Tom was in the study, reviewing documents without really reading them. When his phone buzzed against the desk, Ryan's name appeared on the screen. Tom let it ring once longer than necessary before answering. "Dad?" Ryan's voice was unsteady, thinner than Tom remembered. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Again, Tom didn't respond. He listened to the sound of his son breathing on the other end. Uneven and exposed, silence had become his instinctive defense, and he held to it now, waiting to hear what lived beneath the apology. "I know I've said it before," Ryan continued, rushing now, "and I know words don't mean much anymore, but I need you to know I'm trying. I really am." Tom closed his eyes. He wanted to believe that effort lived behind the words, not just fear. But he'd learned how easily desperation could disguise itself as remorse. "I hear you," he said finally, his tone neutral. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't rejection either. After the call ended, Tom stayed where he was, phone still in his hand. Claire found him there minutes later. She didn't ask what was said. She could see it in his face. "You don't have to forgive him completely," she said softly. "But you can meet him halfway. This distance is killing all of us." Tom looked at her. Really looked. The lines at the corners of her eyes seemed deeper, carved by worry rather than age. "Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences," he said. "If I pretend everything's fine, nothing changes." "I know," Claire replied. "But refusing to move at all doesn't change anything either." They met Ryan the next day at a small park near the river. Winter had stripped the trees bare, branches reaching up like quiet witnesses. Tom arrived first, hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching joggers pass without noticing him. When Ryan appeared, he walked slowly, as if unsure he'd be welcomed closer. They sat on opposite ends of a bench at first. The space between them felt deliberate. "I'm not here to ask for anything," Ryan said after a moment. "Not money, not favors." Tom nodded. "Then talk." Ryan stared out at the water. "I spent a long time telling myself you were the problem," he said. "That if you weren't so distant, I wouldn't feel like this. But that was easier than looking at myself." Tom said nothing. The cold air stung his face, grounding him. "I hated you," Ryan continued, voice low, "because I wanted to be you. I wanted the respect you had, the certainty, and every time I failed, it felt like proof that I never would." The admission landed heavier than any accusation. Tom felt something shift, subtle, unwelcome, human. He thought of all the times he'd assumed Ryan understood him, understood the pressure he carried. He'd never actually said the words that mattered. "I don't know how to fix this," Ryan said quietly. "I just know I don't want to keep running." Tom turned slightly, studying his son's face. The arrogance was gone. In its place was uncertainty, raw and unpolished. "Fixing it takes time," Tom said, "and consistency, not promises." "I know," Ryan replied. "I'll take whatever that looks like." They didn't shake hands. They didn't embrace. They sat there a while longer, speaking in careful sentences, avoiding the edges that still cut too deeply. When they finally stood, it felt less like closure and more like an agreement to continue. Tom drove home alone, the road familiar and quiet. He replayed the conversation, measuring every word, every pause. Part of him felt lighter, as if something long clenched had loosened slightly. Another part remained guarded, aware of how easily hope could become another liability. As the house came into view, Tom realized he didn't yet know which feeling would win, healing or another trap, and that uncertainty followed him inside. Detective Wells didn't soften her tone this time. She didn't need to. Tom stood in his kitchen, with the phone pressed to his ear, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the floor. Claire hovered nearby, sensing the weight of the call before a single word was explained. Tom listened without interrupting, his face tightening with every measured sentence. "The scope has expanded," Detective Wells said. "Significantly. We've identified additional accounts, offshore transfers, layered transactions. This wasn't isolated borrowing. Your son embezzled more than we initially believed." Tom closed his eyes. "Because your name was used to secure several of these instruments," she continued. "Your assets are now under temporary investigation. This doesn't imply guilt, but it does mean scrutiny, freezes, reviews, delays." When the call ended, the silence felt explosive. "What does that mean?" Claire asked immediately, panic threading through her voice. "What kind of investigation?" Tom set the phone down slowly. "It means my business is tangled in his mess," he said. "My name, my work, everything I built." Claire's composure cracked. "This is because you cut him off," she said, words tumbling out. "You pushed him too far. If you just helped him, if you hadn't shut him out." Tom turned sharply. You think this is my fault? He was desperate, Claire insisted, tears spilling now. He felt abandoned. You made him feel like he had no other option. No, Tom said, his voice rising despite himself. He made a choice. Many of them. The front door opened before either of them could say more. Ryan stood there, pale and hollow-eyed, as if the ground beneath him had finally given way. He didn't wait to be invited in. I told them everything, he said hoarsely. All of it. Claire rushed toward him, hands trembling. Ryan. I didn't stop when I should have, Ryan continued, his voice breaking. I kept moving money around, thinking I could fix it before it collapsed. I was wrong. Tom felt heat surge through his chest, sharp and unforgiving. You dragged my name through it, he said. Do you understand what that means? Clients, partners, people who trusted me. Ryan sank onto the couch, covering his face. I was scared, he whispered. Every time I failed, it felt like proof that I'd never measure up. I thought if I could just make it work just once, you'd finally see me. See you? Tom snapped. I see exactly who you are right now. Ryan looked up, eyes red and raw. I need help, he said. Please. I'll do anything. I'll sign whatever you want. I just can't do this alone. Claire turned to Tom, desperation etched across her face. Please, she said. He's breaking. Tom stared at his son, this grown man reduced to pleading, the echoes of entitlement still clinging to his fear. Fury roared through him, not just at Ryan, but at himself for every time he'd mistaken rescue for guidance. My name is under investigation, Tom said slowly. Do you know what that feels like? To watch everything you built be questioned because your own son couldn't stop himself? Ryan shook his head, sobbing now. I was never enough, he cried. I knew it. I felt it every day. The words struck deeper than Tom expected. For a moment, the anger wavered, revealing grief beneath it. Grief for the man Ryan might have been, for the father Tom hadn't fully shown himself to be. But the damage was real, and sentiment wouldn't undo it. Tom stepped closer, his voice trembling not with weakness, but restraint. Then be better, he said. Don't beg. Ryan froze, staring up at him. You want help? Tom continued. Take responsibility. Face what you did. Begging won't save you, change might. The room fell quiet, except for Ryan's uneven breathing. Claire covered her mouth, torn between relief and fear. Tom stood there, heart pounding, knowing this was the true breaking point not just for Ryan, but for the family itself. Whatever came next would determine whether they survived this fallout, or were buried by it. Court dates stacked up quickly after that. Formal letters arrived with unforgiving language, each one carrying a new estimate, a new demand. Legal fees mounted at a pace that left no room for illusion. Ryan moved through the days like a man underwater, attending meetings with his attorney, signing documents he barely understood, watching the consequences of his decisions become permanent ink. Claire watched him unravel, and finally broke. One evening, as Tom sat in the study reviewing yet another financial summary, she stood in the doorway, hands clenched at her sides. Please, she said quietly. One last time. Tom didn't look up. He already knew what she was asking. He's facing court, Claire continued, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay composed. Real consequences. I know he did this to himself. I know. But if you don't help now, really help, there may be nothing left to save. Tom closed the folder and leaned back slowly. I've helped him his entire life. And this time it's different, she said, tears spilling freely now. This time he's scared. Truly scared. That night, Michael came by unannounced, the way he always did when something mattered. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and sat across from Tom without ceremony. You're standing at a fork, Michael said after a long silence. One path protects your pride. The other protects your family. Tom didn't respond. Michael leaned forward. Help him the right way, he said firmly, or you'll lose both your son and your soul. The words followed Tom into the night. Sleep didn't come. Tom lay awake, staring into the dark, replaying everything Ryan as a boy, Ryan as a man, the slow erosion of boundaries disguised as love. He realized then that saving Ryan didn't mean rescuing him. It meant forcing him to stand on ground he'd never learned to trust. By morning, Tom had made his decision. They met at the house later that day. Ryan looked smaller somehow, stripped of bravado, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. Claire hovered nearby, afraid to interrupt. I'll help, Tom said without preamble. But not the way you want. Ryan stiffened. "I'll do anything," he said quickly. "You'll enter therapy," Tom continued, consistently. "No excuses. You'll repay every cent, every dollar that was taken or redirected. No shortcuts. And you will accept whatever sentence comes without asking me to interfere." Ryan swallowed hard. "And if I don't, then this conversation ends," Tom replied calmly. The room held its breath. Ryan nodded slowly. "I accept," he said. "All of it." For the first time, there was no negotiation in his tone. No hidden angle. Just submission to reality. Tom didn't hug him. He didn't offer reassurance. He simply stood, walked back to his study, and initiated the wire transfer. The numbers moved across the screen efficiently, impersonally. When it was done, Tom sat back, feeling neither victory nor relief, only the dull easing of pressure, like a tightened band finally released. Ryan exhaled shakily when he was told. "Thank you," he whispered. Tom met his eyes. "Don't thank me," he said. "Prove it." The house didn't feel healed afterward. Far from it. But something subtle shifted. The air felt less suffocating. Dinner that night lasted a little longer. Words came a little easier. No one spoke of forgiveness. No one pretended things were fixed. Still, beneath the tension, there was something new. Hope not loud, not confident, but fragile and alive. And Tom knew better than to trust it fully. Not yet. The rebuilding didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, without ceremony, in the form of schedules and obligations Ryan couldn't talk his way out of. Therapy sessions twice a week, check-ins with his attorney, community service hours logged and verified. For the first time in his adult life, there was no shortcut, no one smoothing the path ahead of him. Tom watched from a distance. He didn't attend sessions. He didn't ask what was said behind closed doors. Distance, he'd learned, was no longer neglect, it was restraint. He kept his involvement limited to what he'd promised, and nothing more. It was the hardest kind of discipline, the kind that required him to sit with uncertainty instead of controlling it. Claire noticed the shift first. It was in small things. Ryan setting alarms instead of sleeping late, leaving the house with purpose instead of excuses, coming home exhausted in a way that felt earned. She didn't celebrate it openly. She smiled softly, cautiously, as if too much hope might undo the progress. But the constant tension in her shoulders eased, just a little. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe the family might survive this. Jessica's letters arrived every week without fail. Long emails filled with reassurance and perspective, never judgment. She praised Ryan's effort without excusing his past. And she reminded Tom gently that growth often looked unimpressive while it was happening. Tom read every word, though he rarely responded with more than a few careful lines. Still, the steady presence of her belief mattered more than he admitted. Ryan started volunteering at a local food distribution center as part of his restitution. At first, it was obligation hours to log, forms to sign. But as weeks passed, something shifted. He learned names. He listened. He stopped rushing through tasks and started staying late. People began to trust him with responsibility, not because of who his father was, but because he showed up. Tom didn't plan to see it. He drove by the center one afternoon on his way to a meeting, saw Ryan's car in the lot, and pulled in without thinking. He stayed in the background, unnoticed, watching from a distance. Ryan stood at a long table, sleeves rolled up, quietly packing boxes beside an older volunteer. He moved with focus, not performance. When a man struggling with his bags stumbled, Ryan stepped in without hesitation, steadying him, listening patiently. There was no audience, no credit to be claimed. Tom felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not relief, not forgiveness, something closer to recognition. For years, pride had been tied to outcomes, degrees earned, money made, success displayed. Standing there, watching his son do unglamorous work without complaint, Tom realized how narrow his definition had been. This wasn't redemption. It wasn't even trust. But it was effort made visible, and that mattered. Ryan glanced up and caught his eye. For a split second, his expression faltered surprise. Then, something like fear. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply met Tom's gaze and held it. Tom nodded once, subtle and restrained. then turned and left before the moment could stretch into something heavier. Ryan watched him go, heart pounding. That evening, at dinner, nothing was said, but something unspoken passed between them. Ryan moved more carefully, but with purpose. Tom listened more than he spoke. Claire noticed the difference and said nothing, afraid to name it too soon. Later, as Tom sat alone in the study, he thought about the look in Ryan's eyes at the center, not expectation, not entitlement, but something fragile and hopeful. Tom knew better than to confuse effort with transformation. Progress could reverse. Trust could fracture again. Still, for the first time since Christmas, the future didn't feel entirely closed off. And somewhere between caution and pride, Tom allowed himself to wonder quietly what might come next. The warning signs appeared quietly at first, easy to miss if you wanted to believe progress was permanent. A missed therapy session. A vague explanation about a scheduling mix-up. Ryan's answers grew shorter, less precise. Tom noticed immediately. He always did. Discipline had trained his eye to spot patterns, and this one felt uncomfortably familiar, the slow slide from accountability into excuse. Tom didn't confront him right away. He waited, watched, gave space. But when a second session was skipped, the old weight settled back into his chest. Not anger yet, disappointment, the kind that stung sharper because it followed hope. When Tom finally brought it up, Ryan deflected. "It's been a rough week," he said. "I'm still going, just not perfect." Tom felt the word perfect land wrong. "This isn't about perfection," he replied. "It's about showing up." Claire stepped in before the tension could harden. "He's trying," she said too quickly. "You know how hard this is for him." Tom turned toward her, frustration breaking through his restraint. "Trying isn't optional," he said. "It's the condition, and pressure won't help," Claire shot back. "If you keep watching him like he's about to fail, he will." The room went quiet. They both knew there was truth on each side, and that made it worse. That night, Tom barely slept. He stared at the ceiling, replaying every decision since Christmas. Had he moved too fast? Too slow? Had support become control again without him noticing? The temptation to pull back to cut support entirely and let consequences do the work pressed hard against his resolve. He knew that move well. It felt clean. Final. Jessica called the next morning, as if sensing the shift. Tom didn't sugarcoat it. He told her about the missed sessions, the excuses, the fear creeping back in. "Healing isn't linear, Dad," she said gently. "Progress doesn't move in straight lines. It stumbles. It doubles back. That doesn't mean it isn't real." Tom exhaled slowly. "And how many stumbles are acceptable?" "There isn't a number," Jessica replied. "There's only honesty. If he's hiding, that's the problem, not the slip." The words stayed with Tom longer than he wanted to admit. Later that week, Detective Wells called with an update. Ryan's probation review was approaching sooner than expected. Compliance would matter. Documentation, attendance, consistency. The margin for error was narrowing. When Tom relayed the news, Ryan's composure cracked. They were alone in the living room, the house quiet around them. Ryan sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands knotted together. "I'm scared," he admitted, voice thick. "Every time I miss something, it feels like proof I'm going to fail anyway. Like it's already decided." Tom studied him carefully. Not the words, but the posture, the collapse inward, the shame curling at the edges. This wasn't defiance. It was fear. "I don't want to end up back where I was," Ryan continued, eyes wet. "I don't trust myself not to screw this up." Tom felt the old instinct rise, the urge to lecture, to warn, to draw lines sharper. Instead, he did something unfamiliar. He stepped closer and placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. The contact was brief, steady. "Then don't," Tom said quietly. Ryan looked up, confused. "Fear doesn't excuse you," Tom continued, "but it doesn't disqualify you either. You fail when you stop choosing differently." Ryan swallowed hard. "What if I can't?" Tom's grip tightened slightly, grounding rather than forceful. "Then you stand back up," he said. Every time. They sat there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides. Tom hadn't forgiven. He hadn't forgotten. But he hadn't walked away either. As he withdrew his hand, Tom knew this was the most dangerous phase of all. Not crisis, not collapse, but fragile progress tested by doubt. And the next test was already approaching. The lie was small, which somehow made it worse. Tom found it by accident, an account summary left open on the dining table, numbers that didn't align with what Ryan had reported the week before. At first, Tom assumed a misunderstanding. He checked again, then again. The pattern was unmistakable. Funds unaccounted for. Explanations preemptively smoothed over. When Tom confronted him, Ryan didn't hesitate long enough. "It's handled," Ryan said too quickly. "I just didn't want to stress you out." The words landed with a dull finality. Tom felt the familiar surge of anger, sharp and immediate, but beneath it was something colder. Betrayal, renewed. "You lied," Tom said. "Not a question," Ryan bristled. "I was going to tell you." "When?" Tom pressed. "After I found it myself," Ryan's silence answered for him. That night, Tom cut contact. Again. No calls, no messages, no explanations. He withdrew the remaining support he'd promised, leaving only what was legally unavoidable. The decision felt efficient, clean, like cauterizing a wound that refused to close. Claire didn't take it quietly this time. "I can't do this anymore," she said, voice shaking with exhaustion rather than anger. "I can't keep choosing sides every day." Tom stood in the doorway as she packed a small bag, the sound of zippers and drawers closing echoing through the house. "I need space," she said. "From both of you." When the door closed behind her, the house fell into a silence that felt different from before, emptier, sharper. Tom sat alone that night, the weight of his decision pressing in. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself it was discipline. But the justification rang hollow. Jessica arrived 2 days later. She hugged her father tightly, longer than usual, then stepped back and studied him with the same calm scrutiny she'd always had. "You're not wrong," she said gently. "But you're not flexible either." Tom stiffened. He lied. "I know," Jessica replied. "And you shut down." Again. They talked late into the night, the conversation looping through familiar territory, boundaries, consequences, forgiveness. But this time, Jessica pushed harder. "You think control keeps you safe," she said, "but it's isolating you. Just like it isolated him." The words stung because they felt uncomfortably accurate. Ryan, meanwhile, unraveled quickly. Without structure, without supervision, he drifted back toward old habits. Drinks that started as a way to sleep turned into an excuse not to think. He blamed Tom. He blamed the system. He blamed bad luck. Accountability stayed just out of reach, replaced by resentment that numbed the fear underneath. Tom heard fragments of it through Michael, through cautious updates that avoided judgment. He recognized the pattern immediately. He'd lived it himself, once burying discomfort under stubborn certainty, mistaking rigidity for strength. That recognition unsettled him more than any lie. Late one night, Tom sat alone in the study, staring at the safe where the deed folder rested. He thought about the man he'd been for most of his life, controlled, disciplined, emotionally distant. He'd believed those traits made him dependable. Now, he wondered how much damage they'd quietly done. Ryan wasn't just repeating mistakes, he was reflecting them. The realization didn't absolve Ryan of responsibility, but it did shift something in Tom. Control, he understood now, had reached its limit. If anything was going to change, it wouldn't come from ultimatums or silence. It would have to come from truth. Tom picked up his phone and stared at Ryan's number for a long time. He didn't call yet. This time mattered. This time had to be different. When he finally set the phone down, Tom felt the weight of the choice settle in. He would face his son once more, not to manage him, not to rescue him, not to punish him, but to speak plainly and accept whatever came after. They met in the same place Tom had chosen before, a neutral space, stripped of comfort and history. A small office near the courthouse, borrowed from Michael, with bare walls and a single table between them. Tom arrived early. He sat straight-backed, hands folded, composed in a way that felt deliberate, not defensive, final. Ryan came in late. He looked thinner, unshaven. His eyes darted the way they used to when he was trying to stay one step ahead of consequences. He didn't sit right away. He paced, then finally dropped into the chair across from Tom, leaning forward as if proximity might do the work words couldn't. "I just need one more chance," Ryan said quickly. "One last one. I swear I'll do everything right this time." Tom watched him without interruption. He'd heard this rhythm before the urgency. the vows stacked on top of each other, the quiet assumption that mercy was inevitable. "No," Tom said. The word was calm, even gentle, and absolute. Ryan blinked. "No. What?" "No more chances," Tom replied. "Not like this." Ryan's jaw tightened. "You said you wanted truth." "I do," Tom said. "And the truth is, this isn't accountability. It's panic dressed up as effort." Ryan laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. "So that's it? You're done with me?" "I'm done being manipulated," Tom said, his voice steady. "There's a difference." Something in Ryan snapped. "You don't get it," he said, rising from his chair. "You never did. You've always been untouchable. Perfect. The man everyone admired. I was just there, trying to catch up." Tom felt the words hit, sharp but familiar. Ryan's voice broke as the anger collapsed inward. "I've lived my whole life in your shadow," he said, tears spilling now without restraint. "Every mistake I made just proved what I already believed, that I'd never be you. Never enough for you." He sank back into the chair, shoulders shaking. "I didn't even know who I was supposed to be, because all I ever saw was who I wasn't." The room went quiet except for Ryan's sobbing. Tom felt something give way inside him, not collapse, but release. Anger drained out, leaving behind a grief he'd avoided for decades. He saw it clearly now. The boy who'd learned achievement but not affirmation, obedience but not belonging. A son who had mistaken distance for judgment because Tom had never corrected that assumption. Tom leaned forward slowly. "Maybe I never told you," he said, his voice roughening despite his effort to control it. "But I was proud of you." Ryan froze. Tom swallowed, the words scraping their way out. "Not for your successes, not for the money or the image. I was proud of how hard you tried, of how much you wanted it. I thought saying it would make you complacent, weak." He shook his head slightly. "That was my mistake." Ryan covered his face, shoulders collapsing as the sound that escaped him was something closer to grief than anger. Years of resentment poured out between them, unspoken disappointments, misread silences, love withheld out of fear rather than cruelty. Tom stood, then hesitated, then did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled his son into an embrace. It wasn't neat. It wasn't comforting in the way apologies often are. It was heavy, desperate. Two men clinging to each other as if acknowledging how close they'd come to losing everything. Tom felt Ryan's sobs against his chest and didn't pull away. He let them come. He let them exist. In that moment, Tom understood something with painful clarity. Forgiveness wasn't surrender. It wasn't erasing boundaries or excusing damage. It wasn't pretending the past hadn't happened. It was choosing not to let the past be the only thing that survived. When they finally pulled apart, neither of them looked whole. But something fundamental had shifted. The resentment was no longer sealed inside silence. It had been named, shared, broken, open. Tom wiped his eyes and stepped back. "This doesn't fix everything," he said quietly, "but it's real, and it's where we start." Ryan nodded, exhausted, emptied out. "I don't want to run anymore," he said. Tom believed him not fully, not blindly, but enough. As Tom left the room, he knew the hardest part wasn't behind them yet. Forgiveness had opened the door, but what waited on the other side, consequences, accountability, rebuilding, would test them both. Still, for the first time, Tom didn't feel like he was walking away from his son. He felt like he was walking forward with him. The courtroom was colder than Tom expected. Not physically, though. The air was sterile and still, but emotionally, stripped of anything human by procedure and protocol. Wooden benches lined up in rigid rows. Flags stood in the corners like symbols, rather than comforts. Tom took his seat without ceremony, hands folded loosely in his lap, spine straight. He hadn't slept much the night before, but fatigue no longer showed on him the way it once had. Something steadier had taken its place. Ryan sat at the defense table in a dark suit that didn't quite fit the way it should. He looked smaller there, reduced by scale and circumstance. When he glanced back and caught Tom's eye, there was no plea in his expression, just acknowledgement. Claire sat 2 rows behind Tom. The moment Ryan entered, her composure cracked. Tears gathered quickly, silently, the way grief often does when it's been waiting a long time. Jessica slipped into the seat beside her, and took her hand without a word, grounding her as only she could. The proceedings began with formal language charges, read aloud, timelines summarized, losses quantified, fraud, forgery, misrepresentation. Each word landed like a stone, heavy and undeniable. Tom listened without reaction, absorbing the facts without flinching. He didn't look away. He didn't look at Ryan either. This wasn't about judgment anymore. It was about witnessing. When the judge asked how the defendant wished to plead, the room seemed to tighten. "Guilty," Ryan said. The word echoed softly, startling in its clarity. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor looked momentarily surprised. Claire's breath hitched. Her shoulders shook as she pressed her hand to her mouth. Jessica squeezed her fingers harder, anchoring her in the moment. Ryan continued, voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "I accept responsibility for my actions. I don't offer excuses." Tom felt something settle in his chest, not relief, not pride, but recognition. This was accountability spoken aloud, unprotected by conditions or caveats. Whatever else happened now, that mattered. The judge reviewed the restitution paid, the cooperation offered, the steps taken toward rehabilitation, therapy, community service, compliance. The system took note, methodical and unemotional. In light of these factors, the judge said, the court will impose a reduced sentence. Claire sobbed openly then, relief and sorrow colliding in her chest. Jessica wrapped an arm around her shoulders, murmuring reassurances Tom couldn't hear. Ryan stood as the sentence was finalized. When the bailiff stepped forward, he didn't resist. He turned once more toward the gallery, his eyes finding his family. They were wet, but steady. Tom met his gaze. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. He nodded. It wasn't approval. It wasn't forgiveness spoken aloud. It was acknowledgement, the quiet closing of a chapter that had demanded its price. As Ryan was led from the room, Claire cried his name once before catching herself. The doors closed with a soft finality that lingered longer than the sound itself. Outside, the winter air felt sharp and clean. Tom stood on the courthouse steps, the sky pale and indifferent overhead. The weight he'd been carrying for months felt different now, not gone, but redistributed, no longer crushing his chest. Claire leaned into Jessica, exhausted. Michael stood nearby, silent, respectful of the moment. Tom watched the doors where Ryan had disappeared. "This ends today," he whispered. Not the consequences, not the work ahead, but the cycle, the silence, the unspoken resentment, the illusion that control could replace truth. For the first time since Christmas, Tom felt the ground beneath him hold steady. And though the road forward remained uncertain, it was no longer defined by denial. It was defined by choice. Time softened the sharp edges, not all at once, but enough to make the days livable again. Months passed. Winter gave way to early spring, and Ryan served his community service quietly, without complaint. There were no speeches, no attempts to turn the work into redemption theater. He cleaned parks, stocked shelves at shelters, showed up early, and left late. The routine was humbling in a way courtrooms never were. It stripped away excuses and left only effort. Tom watched from afar, as he always did now. He had started therapy shortly after the sentencing, something he never would have considered before. Sitting in a small office across from a woman who asked questions he couldn't deflect with logic or authority felt unsettling. He learned words he'd avoided most of his life. Emotional distance, control as safety, withholding as protection. Naming those habits didn't excuse them, but it gave Tom something he'd never had before: awareness. At home, the atmosphere shifted slowly. Claire returned after a few weeks, cautious but hopeful. They didn't rehash the past. They didn't need to. Evenings became quiet again, but not tense. Shared dinners, soft conversations, the comfort of sitting together without bracing for the next argument. Sometimes they watched old movies. Sometimes they said nothing at all. The bitterness that once lived between them loosened its grip. Ryan wrote letters, not emails, not texts. Letters, written by hand, arriving every few weeks with careful, deliberate language. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't defend himself. He acknowledged harm plainly, naming specific moments, specific wounds. Tom read each one slowly, sometimes twice, absorbing the weight of words that didn't try to escape responsibility. When Easter approached, Jessica came home. She noticed the change immediately, not because everything was fixed, but because everything was quieter. The house no longer felt like a battleground disguised as a home. Pride had receded, replaced by something steadier. Peace, fragile but real. "You look different," she told Tom one afternoon as they prepared dinner together. He considered it. "I feel different," he said finally. Ryan was allowed supervised breaks from his service to attend family gatherings. Easter dinner was simple. No grand declarations, just shared food and cautious smiles. When Ryan laughed at something, Michael said, the sound didn't tighten Tom's chest the way it once had. A week later, Tom visited Ryan during one of his service days. He didn't announce himself. He parked across the street and watched for a moment, seeing his son move through the work with quiet focus. When Ryan noticed him, there was no panic, no defensiveness, just acknowledgement. They walked together for a while, hands in their pockets, the air cool and clean around them. "How's it going?" Tom asked. Ryan shrugged lightly. "It's hard, but it's honest." Tom nodded. That felt right. They talked not about the past in detail, not about blame, but about small things. Books Ryan was reading, a job opportunity that might open later, therapy sessions that were uncomfortable but necessary. Tom listened without interrupting, without correcting. When they fell silent, it wasn't awkward. They stood there, father and son, sharing space without needing to fill it. Tom realized then how rare that had always been, how often silence between them had meant punishment, not peace. Now, it meant neither was running. As Tom drove home later, he thought about how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. Healing wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It revealed itself in restraint, in consistency, in choosing not to reopen old wounds just to feel powerful. That night, Tom sat in the study, the fire low, the house quiet. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. And though the future remained uncertain, Tom understood something fundamental at last. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning how to live with it together. Ryan completed his sentence on an overcast Monday morning, the kind that felt deliberately unremarkable. No ceremony marked the end, no speech, no applause. He signed the final paperwork, returned a vest, and walked out carrying nothing but a folded jacket and the weight of what he'd learned. Freedom, he realized, didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with responsibility. 2 weeks later, he started working part-time at a local hardware store. The job wasn't impressive. Early hours, sore hands, modest pay. But it was honest, and that mattered more than Ryan would have admitted out loud. He showed up on time. He listened. He learned. When customers asked questions he couldn't answer, he didn't pretend he found someone who could. Tom noticed the change in small ways. Ryan stopped circling conversations, stopped positioning himself for rescue. When he came by the house, he didn't linger, didn't test boundaries. He spoke plainly, left when he said he would. It wasn't confidence yet, but it was consistency. One evening, as Tom was leaving the study, Ryan stood in the doorway, hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Tom paused. "Go ahead." Ryan exhaled. "I'm trying to figure out next steps, not financially. Just how to think about it, how to build something without cutting corners." Tom studied him, searching for the old angle, the hidden ask. He found none, only uncertainty and restraint. "You want advice," Tom said. "Not money." Ryan nodded. "Yes." A faint smile touched Tom's face before he could stop it. "Now that's a start." They sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had witnessed so many fractures, and talked through practical things. Skills, patience, reputation. Tom didn't lecture. He shared. He spoke about mistakes he'd made, risks he'd misjudged, the cost of shortcuts he'd been lucky to survive. Ryan listened without interrupting, absorbing not just the words but the tone measured, unguarded. From the hallway, Claire watched them. She didn't step in. She didn't speak. Tears gathered quietly as she took in the scene. Her husband and son leaning toward each other, not arguing, not defending, just talking. For months, she'd carried the fear that she would never see this again. Now it unfolded without fanfare, fragile and real. Jessica called that night from abroad, her voice warm with cautious optimism. "I don't want to jinx it," she said, "but this feels like a miracle in progress." Tom almost laughed. Almost. What he felt instead was release. The grip of guilt he'd carried over missed moments, unspoken pride, rigid control began to loosen. He didn't erase it, He didn't pretend it had never mattered. He simply stopped letting it dictate every decision. Control, he was learning, wasn't the same as care. The bond forming between him and Ryan felt unfamiliar. It lacked certainty. It required patience. It asked him to trust without guarantees. But it was real in a way their old dynamic had never been. When Ryan left that evening, he thanked Tom, not effusively, not emotionally, just once. "For the time," he said. Tom nodded. "Any time." As the door closed, Tom stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet settle around him. He knew this wasn't an ending. Setbacks were still possible. Trust could still be tested. But for the first time, he wasn't bracing for collapse. He was standing in the middle of change, and that felt like enough for now. Thanksgiving arrived quietly that year, without the forced optimism that had once defined family gatherings. The house filled with familiar sounds, pots clinking, the low hum of conversation, the rustle of coats being hung by the door, but something essential was different. No one was bracing. No one was performing. It was real. Tom stood at the kitchen counter, carving the turkey with steady hands, while Claire moved beside him, passing plates, exchanging small looks that said more than words ever had. Jessica had come home early, filling the space with her calm presence, grounding the room simply by being there. Ryan arrived last, not out of avoidance, but caution. He paused in the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside, shoulders relaxed but alert, as if honoring how far he'd come. They sat together at the table, every chair filled. As dinner unfolded, conversation flowed naturally. Stories were shared. Laughter rose without hesitation. The past wasn't ignored, but it no longer hovered like a threat. It rested where it belonged, acknowledged, but no longer in control. Halfway through the meal, Ryan cleared his throat. The table quieted. "I just want to say something," he began, voice steady but sincere. "I know this isn't easy to hear, and I don't want to make a moment out of it, but I need to say it." Tom looked up slowly. "Dad," Ryan continued, meeting his eyes, "you gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. You didn't rescue me. You didn't protect me from the consequences. But you didn't abandon me either. That changed everything." The words landed softly, without spectacle. Tom felt his chest tighten not with discomfort, but emotion he no longer tried to suppress. He set his fork down. "I need to say something too," he replied. "I spent years believing distance was discipline, that providing was enough. I was wrong." He paused, choosing honesty over control. "I'm sorry for the silence. For the years I stayed guarded instead of present." Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, tears forming again. But this time, they carried relief instead of grief. Jessica smiled gently, eyes bright. They raised their glasses together. "To new beginnings," Claire said. "And old lessons," Jessica added. Ryan smiled, then took a breath. "There's something else," he said. "I've been working on a plan. I want to start a small charity, nothing big at first. It'll help families who've been affected by financial fraud. Legal guidance, counseling referrals, the things we didn't know how to find when everything fell apart." The table went still. Tom studied his son, not looking for flaws this time, but intention. He saw none of the old ambition there. No hunger for recognition, just purpose, shaped by experience. "That's meaningful," Tom said finally. Ryan nodded. "It feels like the right way to give back, to make sure what I did doesn't end with me." Pride stirred in Tom, not the kind tied to achievement or status, but something quieter and deeper. Redemption. Not perfection, but responsibility carried forward. When dinner ended, they stood together in the living room, arms wrapping naturally, without hesitation or stiffness. It wasn't a moment frozen in time. It was alive, warm, imperfect, honest. As Tom looked around the room, he realized the bitterness that had once defined this family no longer held power here. It had done its damage. It had taught its lessons, and now it was finally loosening its grip. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning earned, fragile, and real. The study looked exactly the same as it always had. Same dark shelves lined with books Tom hadn't opened in years. Same heavy desk positioned just close enough to the fireplace to feel its warmth. Same leather chair, worn at the arms, shaped by decades of long nights and hard decisions. Yet as Tom stepped inside, he felt no trace of the anger that had once lived here. This was the room where everything had shifted. He crossed to the safe and knelt, the metal cool beneath his fingertips. The click of the lock echoed softly as the door opened. Inside lay the deed folder, thick, orderly, unchanged. Months ago, it had felt like a weapon, a line in the sand, a way to reclaim dignity after humiliation. He remembered the night he'd opened it with clenched teeth, fueled by wounded pride and the certainty that control would make the pain stop. It hadn't. Tom lifted the folder, feeling its weight without the charge it once carried. He placed it back carefully, not with resolve, but with acceptance. When he closed the safe, there was no rush of satisfaction, only calm, the kind that came from knowing something no longer owned you. A knock at the door pulled him from the moment. Michael walked in carrying a bottle of whiskey and a familiar grin. "Figured I'd find you in here," he said. "This room's like a magnet for self-reflection." They poured 2 glasses and sat across from each other, the fire low and steady between them. Conversation drifted easily, old stories, mistakes they'd survived, moments that once felt catastrophic but now earned a laugh. It was the kind of laughter that came from distance and perspective, not denial. After a while, Tom stared into his glass and spoke quietly. "I really thought revenge would fix me," he admitted. "I thought drawing hard lines and watching him suffer the consequences would make everything right." Michael nodded, unsurprised. "And?" "It didn't," Tom said. "It just made me harder. Healing did the work. Revenge couldn't." Michael raised his glass slightly. "Took you long enough to see that." Later that night, after Michael left, the house settled into silence. Snow had begun to fall outside, soft and unhurried. Jessica called just before midnight. "You sound lighter," she said after a few minutes of conversation. "I feel lighter," Tom replied. There was a pause. Then she said, "Have you ever thought about writing to Ryan? Not advice, not conditions, just gratitude." After the call ended, Tom returned to the study and sat at the desk. He pulled a blank sheet of paper from the drawer and held his pen loosely, uncertain. He'd written contracts, warnings, and instructions his entire life. This was different. This required honesty without leverage. He began slowly. He didn't write about money. He didn't write about mistakes. He didn't write about boundaries. He wrote about pride he'd never spoken aloud, about watching his son choose accountability when no one was forcing him to, about learning too late, but not uselessly, that strength didn't mean silence. "You didn't just earn back my trust," he wrote. "You taught me forgiveness." Tom set the pen down and leaned back, staring out the window as snow blanketed the yard. The world looked quiet, clean, forgiving. For the first time since that Christmas night, Tom felt something settle deep in his chest. Not triumph, not relief, but peace. The quiet joy of a man who no longer needed to be right, only present. And he knew, without doubt, that this was his true redemption. New Year's Eve arrived quietly, without ceremony or expectation. Snow lay thick across the yard, softening the edges of the world, muting sound until everything felt held in suspension. The house glowed warmly behind the windows, but Tom stepped outside anyway, drawn by the stillness. The cold air bit gently at his face, sharp and clean. Ryan followed a moment later, pulling his coat tighter as he joined his father in the yard. Neither spoke at first. Their breath rose in pale clouds as they walked side by side, boots crunching softly through the snow. It felt unfamiliar and right to share silence without tension. "I used to hate nights like this," Ryan said finally. "Too much time to think." Tom nodded. "I used to think that was a weakness." Ryan glanced at him, then looked back at the snow-covered ground. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "Not for the money, not for the help, but for not giving up completely even when I gave you every reason to." Tom stopped walking. He turned slowly, studying his son's face in the dim light spilling from the house. He saw the man Ryan had become, not perfect, not finished, but honest in a way that mattered. "I didn't always do it right," Tom said quietly, "but I learned something too." He paused, choosing the words with care. "Forgiveness isn't easy, but it's the only way we heal." Ryan swallowed, emotion tightening his throat. He nodded once, unable to speak. From the window, Claire watched them. Her breath caught as she saw the way they stood together, not guarded, not divided, just present. Tears welled in her eyes, shining as she pressed her hand lightly to the glass. For so long, she had feared this moment would never come, that the damage would outlast their love. Seeing them now felt like witnessing something sacred. The door opened behind her. Jessica stepped out, wrapping a scarf around her neck as she joined them in the snow. She slipped her arm through Claire's first, then through Tom's, pulling them together without comment. No one resisted. They stood there as the distant sound of fireworks echoed faintly from the neighborhood beyond the trees. Colors flickered against the clouds, muted by snowfall. Ryan laughed softly, surprised by the sound of it. It felt strange, foreign, but good. Soon, laughter followed more easily. Michael cracked a joke about resolutions no one ever kept. Claire shook her head, smiling through tears. For the first time in years, the laughter didn't feel forced or fragile. It rose naturally, warming the cold night. Tom looked around at his family, the circle complete. He thought about the man he'd been, the control, the silence, the pride that had once felt like strength. He thought about everything it had cost him, and everything it had nearly destroyed. As midnight approached, Tom and Ryan drifted slightly ahead of the others, their footsteps aligning as they walked toward the edge of the yard. The future stretched before them, uncertain but open. No guarantees, no illusions, just choice. Side by side, father and son continued forward, their bond no longer defined by anger or fear, but by forgiveness hard won and freely given, a testament to the quiet power of choosing each other again.